The family that owned slavery. The story of the DeWolf family begins with a quiet lie that America tried very hard to forget. Because this family did not just benefit from slavery, they practically turned it into a family business empire that lasted generations. They were from Bristol, Rhode Island, a town that looks peaceful today, but once ran on human bondage like a factory runs on fuel. The DeWolfs discovered early on that selling human beings was easier and more profitable than farming, building, or trading normal goods. Instead of asking whether something was moral, they asked whether it was profitable. And slavery answered with a number so high that morality became irrelevant. They built ships not just for fishing or cargo, but for kidnapping Africans from their homeland and forcing them across the Atlantic. Each ship they launched became another chapter in a long family tradition of cruelty disguised as commerce. They moved people like inventory and priced children the same way one might price livestock. The DeWolfs became wealthy because every person they chained down earned them more land, more power, and more influence. They invested in sugar plantations that demanded endless human suffering to keep turning a profit. They bought politicians the way today's oligarchs buy lobbyists, making sure no law touched their business. They used friendly judges, friendly governors, and even friendly church leaders to protect their operations. When America tried to regulate slavery, the DeWolfs simply ignored the law and paid whoever needed to be paid to look away. Their family name entered high society, but the truth behind their success was built on screams buried under the Atlantic. They became one of the richest and most powerful families in New England without ever wanting the world to see what made them rich. Their world looked elegant from the outside, filled with mansions, fine clothes, and elite parties. But behind every glass of wine served in those mansions was the labor of people who never had the chance to live freely. They believed they were untouchable because generations of politicians allowed them to be. The public rarely questioned them because their power made them seem respectable. And that is how the DeWolf family quietly became the largest slave-trading dynasty in American history, without most Americans ever learning their name. Their silence was their shield, and their wealth was their weapon. And for over a century, both kept the truth buried deep. The DeWolfs didn't just participate in the slave trade, they industrialized it in a way that made slavery feel like a normal business operation. They built a full supply chain that started in New England, stretched to West Africa, and ended in the Caribbean plantations they controlled. They would load their ships with rum made in Rhode Island, sail to Africa, and exchange the rum for kidnapped human beings. This created a cycle where every trip guaranteed them more profit than the last. Their ships were designed to pack as many people as possible, with little space left for basic human needs. They understood that the more people they stuffed inside, the more money they made, even if many died along the way. They treated death as a minor inconvenience, something already included in their financial calculations. When their ships arrived in the Caribbean, the enslaved people were sold to the highest bidder like merchandise in a marketplace. The DeWolfs then bought sugar, molasses, and coffee produced by slave labor and shipped it back to America. The same sugar and molasses was used again to produce more rum, restarting the entire cycle and deepening their profits. Their empire became self-sustaining because every part of the chain fed into the next part. They built plantations in Cuba where the work was so brutal that enslaved workers rarely survived long enough to start families. Instead of improving conditions, the DeWolfs simply imported more people, treating human life as replaceable. They owned banks, insurance companies, and factories that all helped protect and expand their slave trading system. The DeWolfs even insured their ships and enslaved people as property, proving how normal they considered the business. Whenever public backlash grew, they used political influence to make sure slavery stayed legal and profitable for them. They created a world where morality never intersected with business, only money did. And thanks to their ruthless efficiency, the DeWolf family became a symbol of how far greed can go when no one dares to stop it. The DeWolf's empire survived for so long because the entire town of Bristol quietly supported it, benefited from it, or simply avoided questioning it. The townspeople worked in their rum distilleries, sailed on their ships, or processed goods produced by enslaved labor. This meant the DeWolfs didn't just run a family business, they ran the local economy. People ignored the horrors behind the wealth because their own livelihoods depended on it. Bristol became a community built on collective denial, pretending they didn't know where the money came from while gladly spending it. Churches blessed the family and praised their donations, even though those donations came from human suffering. Local politicians protected them because challenging the DeWolfs meant risking their careers. Newspapers rarely criticized them either, out of fear or because the DeWolfs controlled too much of the local power structure.
The family's ships docked at the town harbor openly, yet no one asked why they left with rum and came back with sugar from slave plantations. When slave people were brought into Bristol temporarily, most residents turned their heads and pretended it wasn't happening. The DeWolf used respectability as a disguise, hosting elegant social events that distracted from their crimes. Their wealth bought silence from almost everyone around them. As long as the town continued to benefit, the truth stayed buried under layers of politeness and denial. This silence became one of the most powerful tools in the DeWolf Empire. It allowed them to commit crimes against humanity while looking like pillars of society. And that is how an entire American town became an accomplice in one of the darkest family empires in U.S. history. The DeWolfs were not just a local family. They built an empire that spanned the Atlantic, connecting continents with human suffering as currency. Their ships regularly sailed from Rhode Island to West Africa, capturing men, women, and children who had never known freedom. They brought them to the Caribbean and sold them on plantations where survival was measured in weeks, not years. The profits flowed back to America in the form of sugar, molasses, rum, and raw wealth that enriched not only the family, but everyone who did business with them. Their network included corrupt politicians, complicit merchants, and even other slave traders who became partners in this grim supply chain. The DeWolfs realized early that scale meant more money, and cruelty was just a cost of doing business. They innovated shipping methods to maximize capacity, reduce losses, and increase profits, even if that meant suffering unimaginable to the people trapped inside. Every voyage became a well-oiled machine of exploitation, turning ordinary commerce into industrialized horror. The family used their influence to manipulate laws across borders, bribing officials to allow their operations to continue unimpeded. They sent coded letters to coordinate shipments and manage finances across continents, as if trading goods, not lives. Their wealth allowed them to secure mansions, luxury, and status in American high society, all while hiding the blood on their hands. They invested in new ships, new plantations, and even new technologies to keep human suffering profitable. The DeWolfs were careful to avoid scandals, but whispers always followed them. Rumors of human cargo, cruelty, and death. They understood that secrecy was power, and the more invisible the crime, the safer their fortune. Across the Atlantic, they became synonymous with terror, but in America, they were celebrated as successful merchants. They trained each generation in the family business, teaching greed as a skill, cruelty as a tool, and secrecy as an art. The family empire thrived for over a century because the DeWolfs treated slavery not as a moral question, but as an algorithm for money. They understood that empires are built on systems, not ethics, and they mastered that system with terrifying efficiency. And so the DeWolf shadow stretched across oceans, leaving a trail of misery behind every profitable voyage. Every handshake, every contract, every coin in their empire was tied to human suffering, and the world largely looked away. Even after the Atlantic slave trade officially ended, the DeWolf family continued to profit in secret, adapting their crimes to new forms while keeping their reputation untarnished. They shifted into industries connected to slavery, such as sugar processing, banking, and shipping, ensuring that their money kept growing while the blood on their hands became invisible. They maintained a veneer of respectability, hosting lavish parties, donating to churches, and marrying into influential families to protect their legacy. The truth was always hidden behind family lore, whitewashed histories, and carefully curated public records. Schools never taught the extent of their crimes, and most textbooks skipped over Rhode Island's darkest chapter. Descendants inherited wealth and social status without having to answer for the human suffering that created it. Yet some whispers persisted, stories of the ships, the plantations, and the people who never made it back across the Atlantic. A few journalists and historians attempted to expose the truth, but their findings were often dismissed as exaggeration or forgotten entirely. The DeWolfs mastered the art of legacy laundering, turning horror into respectability over generations. They donated to public institutions, funded libraries, and became pillars of their community while avoiding accountability. Their ability to rewrite history demonstrated how power and wealth can manipulate the public perception of morality. They became a living example of how a family can profit from evil while wearing a mask of good. And even today, their mansions stand, their descendants prosper, and the full horror of their empire is still shocking to uncover. They taught each generation that money excuses everything, and that silence protects wealth. Anyone questioning them was ignored, silenced, or bought off. Their story is a cautionary tale of how evil can be normalized when society refuses to look too closely. The DeWolfs didn't just own slavery, they owned the narrative, and that narrative lasted far longer than any single voyage. They weaponized forgetfulness, turning the moral blindness of others into a shield. And the deeper you dig, the more you realize that their empire was not only profitable, but almost untouchable for generations. It was a legacy built on not innovation or talent, but on human misery. and yet it is rarely taught in schools.
The real story of the DeWolfs is not about ships, profits, or mansions. It is about the human lives destroyed to build an empire. Thousands of Africans were ripped from their homes, packed into ships, and sold to plantations where survival was never guaranteed. Families were torn apart, cultures erased, and people forced to work under conditions no human should ever endure. Each voyage left hundreds dead, and the ones who survived lived under constant fear, brutality, and deprivation. The DeWolfs treated death as a statistic, calculating profit margins without regard for human suffering. Children were sold alongside adults, stripped of their names, identities, and freedom. Mothers never saw their children grow up, and fathers were forced to watch families disintegrate for the sake of profit. The plantations they controlled became machines of suffering, maintained by the relentless cruelty of the DeWolf family and their overseers. Diseases, malnutrition, and exhaustion were considered normal, and medical care was minimal, if any. Survivors carried scars, physical and psychological, that lasted generations. The DeWolfs never faced the people whose lives they ruined, and history often shielded them from accountability. Their cruelty was systematic, calculated, and disguised as legitimate business. The world looked away because wealth and power made evil look respectable. Every mansion, every donation, every business investment carried the weight of stolen human lives. The legacy of pain extended beyond history books. It lingers in descendants, communities, and the collective conscience of humanity. The story of the DeWolfs reminds us how human suffering can be commodified when society prioritizes money over morality. It exposes the cost of silence, complicity, and moral blindness, and it forces us to ask a hard question. How many other empires were built on suffering that we still don't see? The human cost of the DeWolf's empire was invisible to many, but it was real, horrific, and undeniable. It is a story of greed so extreme that it became a family tradition, passed down through generations with calculated efficiency. The pain, the screams, and the injustice were buried under wealth, and only those willing to look closely can see the full scope. The DeWolf's greed was more than ambition. It was a mindset that treated human life as currency. They didn't just want wealth. They wanted total domination over a system that could make them untouchable. Every decision they made was measured by profit margins, not morality, and every voyage was an opportunity to multiply their fortune. They bribed politicians, manipulated trade laws, and used their influence to silence critics, ensuring that their empire expanded without interference. They invested in new ships and ports, constantly innovating ways to extract more money from suffering. Insurance policies were taken out on enslaved people, showing how they monetized human lives in every possible way. They studied market trends, learned which ports were most profitable, and planned kidnapping missions with military precision. Even competitors recognized the scale and efficiency of the DeWolf operations, yet few dared to challenge them. The family passed down this mindset to each generation, ensuring that greed was institutionalized. Children learned that wealth was power, and morality was a hindrance, not a guideline. Their ruthless pursuit of profit blurred every line of humanity, creating a culture where cruelty was not only accepted but celebrated. Each mansion, ship, and plantation became a monument to this relentless drive. They expanded their empire to Cuba, the Caribbean, and even South America, adapting to new markets while keeping human suffering at the core. Political connections ensured they remained untouchable, and law enforcement rarely intervened. They even developed clever accounting methods to hide illegal profits, making their crimes almost invisible on paper. Families they enslaved were stripped of identity, culture, and freedom, while the DeWolfs calculated their next move. They created a system where efficiency and cruelty were intertwined, proving that organization could amplify evil. Money became a weapon, a shield, and a legacy, all at the expense of thousands. They understood that the richer they became, the more invisible their crimes could remain, and so greed became both their strategy and their signature, leaving a trail of pain across oceans and generations. The DeWolf's mansions were more than homes. They were symbols of power built on blood and secrecy. Visitors would see elegance, luxury, man-high society, but hidden beneath the surface was a history of unimaginable suffering. The walls of these estates were silent witnesses to a legacy that no one wanted to acknowledge. Fine furniture, Grand ballrooms and lavish parties mask the fact that every penny came from the labor and misery of enslaved people. Servants in these homes were sometimes distant relatives of the enslaved, working under conditions nearly as strict as the plantations. Wealth allowed the family to invest in culture, art, and philanthropy, but the origin of that wealth remained a secret. The DeWolfs were skilled at managing appearances, making generosity and refinement a shield for their climbs. Guests would leave inspired by the family's success, unaware that it was built on human suffering. Letters, ledgers, and diaries hidden in these mansions documented the cold, calculated nature of their empire. They recorded shipments, sales, and profits with precision, as if tracking livestock instead of human lives. Upstairs bedrooms and parlors became places where the family celebrated success, oblivious or indifferent to the horrors that made it possible. Their legacy was a careful balance of visibility and invisibility. Everyone could see their wealth, but few could see its foundation. Generations were taught to maintain this facade, ensuring that the truth never overshadowed the family's public image. Even today, walking through these mansions, one can sense the weight of a hidden past that refuses to be forgotten. Their estates became monuments to deceit, luxury hiding horror, and history shaped by silence. The DeWolfs mastered the art of moral camouflage, making cruelty almost invisible behind wealth. Every artwork, every donation, every public act was a calculated distraction from their crimes. The mansions whispered secrets only a few dared to uncover, standing as silent witnesses to one of America's darkest family legacies. And within those walls, the family continued to teach the next generation that image mattered more than truth, power mattered more than justice, and wealth could hide almost anything.
Despite their wealth and power, the DeWolfs could not completely escape whispers of guilt and moral reckoning. Some family members occasionally felt unease, small pangs of conscience that the family quickly suppressed. They wrote letters debating morality, debated briefly in private rooms, and even made minor charitable donations to soothe their discomfort. But these acts never challenged the system. They were cosmetic, ways to reduce personal guilt without threatening profit. Outsiders occasionally questioned the family, journalists or foreign diplomats raising concerns, yet local allies always protected them. Some descendants acknowledged in private journals that the empire had been built on unimaginable suffering. Still, they rationalized it as necessary for survival, power, and the preservation of the family legacy. The weight of thousands of lives lost never entirely disappeared, but silence and wealth made it easier to ignore. Gossip about plantations, ships, and deaths circulated quietly in Bristol and beyond, but very few dared to publicly confront the DeWolfs. Religious leaders offered blessings that conflicted with the hidden truth, creating cognitive dissonance that allowed society to accept the family's wealth. Occasionally, critics wrote scathing letters or reports, but money and influence always drowned them out. The family became experts in controlling narratives, using influence, charm, and intimidation to silence dissent. They knew the truth existed, but they treated it as a minor inconvenience compared to the vast fortunes they controlled. Moral questions were deferred, rationalized, or dismissed as long as the empire continued to grow. Each generation became better at ignoring whispers, more skilled at framing history, and more efficient at hiding the consequences of their actions. Even when confronted privately, they justified their cruelty as business, culture, or survival. Money became a buffer against guilt, and power became a shield against scrutiny. And while whispers persisted, they rarely translated into action, leaving the DeWolfs' crimes largely unchallenged for centuries. Their ability to suppress conscience as effectively as rivals demonstrates the dangerous intersection of wealth, influence, and human denial. In the end, even subtle awareness of guilt could not overcome the family's culture of cruelty and greed. The DeWolfs' greatest asset was silence, society's, their communities, and their own. People avoided questioning them because challenging such wealth meant risking one's livelihood, reputation, or even safety. The family reinforced this culture by rewarding loyalty and punishing dissent, creating a network of people invested in secrecy. Banks, politicians, and merchants all participated in maintaining appearances, ensuring that the world rarely glimpsed the truth. Even historians often overlook the family's crimes, partially due to a lack of surviving evidence and partially due to the influence the DeWolfs wielded over local narratives. Families in Bristol prospered alongside them, complicit in the unspoken agreement that money excused cruelty. The empire thrived not only because of efficiency and brutality, but because no one spoke up. Silence became a commodity as valuable as sugar, rum, or shipping contracts. When complaints arose, bribes, legal threats, and influence sufficed to quiet critics. The family wrote history in subtle ways, donating to archives, funding libraries, and influencing publications, ensuring that their perspective dominated. Even today, traces of their crimes are buried, often overshadowed by tales of business success and societal contributions. Their ability to turn guilt, fear, and morality into silence demonstrates an understanding of human psychology as keen as their business acumen. Every ship, every plantation, every contract reinforced the unspoken rule: do not question the DeWolfs. Even those within the family who doubted their actions learned quickly that speaking out could jeopardize wealth and influence. Society's compliance, whether through ignorance or convenience, amplified the family's power. Silence allowed the DeWolfs to continue innovating, expanding, and profiting from human misery with minimal interference. They became experts at managing perception, ensuring that their empire appeared legitimate even while it thrived on exploitation. Their mastery of silence shows that empires are often protected more by complicity than by force. And in this silence, the human cost was buried, leaving the world to discover centuries later the full horror of their empire. Ultimately, the DeWolfs proved that when no one dares to speak, evil can grow unchecked, hidden beneath layers of wealth, respectability, and carefully maintained lies. The Atlantic Ocean was both a highway and a graveyard for the DeWolf Empire. Ships left Rhode Island loaded with rum and returned with human cargo, each voyage leaving a trail of death, suffering, and stolen freedom. Storms, disease, and malnutrition claimed countless lives, yet the DeWolfs calculated everything as a cost of doing business. Families were torn apart during the Middle Passage, with mothers separated from children, siblings sold to strangers, and husbands stripped from wives forever. Survivors endured unimaginable conditions on plantations, forced to work from sunrise to sunset under overseers trained to maximize cruelty. Every prophet was a reminder of the human suffering that fueled it, yet the family treated it as an abstract number on a ledger. They believed that oceans, distance, and secrecy could hide the horror from the public eye. Merchants in Europe and the Americas benefited from their operations, often ignoring the origins of the goods they traded. The Atlantic became a network of exploitation, with the DeWolfs at its center, orchestrating every voyage like a conductor directing an orchestra of suffering. Ships were meticulously planned to avoid inspection, to maximize survival of the cargo enough to ensure profit, and to return with goods that expanded their empire. Families in West Africa were devastated, communities disrupted, and cultures erased to feed the demand for labor across the ocean. The legacy of these voyages remains in the scars, stories, and lineage of those enslaved. Even centuries later, the Atlantic carries memories of chains, fear, and desperation that historians struggle to quantify. The DeWolfs treated the ocean as a tool, a barrier, and a conveyor belt for human misery. Their influence stretched from port to port, affecting not just their victims, but entire economies, politics, and societies. And yet, for most of American history, the story of these voyages was barely acknowledged. The Atlantic stands as a reminder of the empire's reach, the cruelty engineered for profit, and the vast human cost buried beneath waves. Each shipment was a carefully calculated act of exploitation designed to maximize financial gain while minimizing attention. Their mastery of the Atlantic allowed them to dominate the trade while the world pretended not to see. And in the shadows of these waters lies the evidence of one of history's most efficient yet morally bankrupt family empires. The wealth the DeWolfs accumulated did more than enrich a family. It reshaped communities, politics, and even the perception of morality in New England. Their money funded schools, churches, mansions, and businesses, creating an illusion of respectability and generosity. But this same wealth was built on generations of exploitation, violence, and death, linking every dollar to suffering. Descendants inherited mansions, fortunes, and social status without ever confronting the cost behind it. Some attempted to rationalize or ignore the past, framing the family as industrious merchants rather than criminals.
Their empire influenced local economies, making towns dependent on their business and silencing opposition through financial leverage. Wealth became both a shield and a weapon, protecting the family from scrutiny while intimidating anyone who might question them. Even historians found it difficult to fully expose the truth because financial records were incomplete, destroyed, or intentionally obfuscated. Political influence and charitable acts allowed the family to rewrite the narrative, emphasizing success over morality. Their fortune was both a product and a perpetuator of silence, a reminder that power often protects the guilty. Communities prospered on the back of labor that was stolen and lives that were destroyed, creating a moral imbalance that would echo for centuries. The family's ability to turn wealth into influence demonstrates how economic power can normalize or hide even the worst crimes. Each new generation was taught that preserving wealth and status outweighed confronting historical atrocities. The long shadow of their fortune affected society's understanding of right and wrong, profit and morality. It created a precedent where economic power could excuse cruelty and silence dissent. Even today, buildings, businesses, and institutions connected to the DeWolfs carry the weight of their hidden crimes. Their fortune ensured that history would remember their wealth more vividly than the suffering it caused. The moral cost was obscured, leaving only traces for those willing to dig deeper. And this long shadow is a warning. When wealth is built on exploitation, its influence extends far beyond the family, shaping culture, politics, and morality. The DeWolf's money became a legacy, but the true cost remains invisible to many, haunting generations in silence. The story of the DeWolfs is not just a historical curiosity, it is a lesson in power, greed, and the consequences of silence. For centuries, their empire thrived because no one dared to speak, because society benefited, and because wealth can mask even the most brutal crimes. Remembering their story means acknowledging the thousands of lives destroyed to build